Hello and welcome back to the Future Value Podcast. I'm John Pellosie alongside Justin Ahner and Joe Freemont, as always. And this is Volume 10 of the Future Value Podcast. So we're really excited to be bringing the 10th episode. We're in the double digits, guys.
Ooh, we did it.
That's an exciting milestone.
Yeah.
Today, we are talking about something that honestly is probably the biggest financial decision that people make in their lifetimes. And that is the home purchase process. So we're going to be diving into all of the different facets that go into purchasing a home, the things that people need to be thinking about both financially and just around lifestyle when it comes to picking a new home. Before people make a home purchase, obviously it's very important that they understand all the financial ramifications in their financial situation. But equally as important is to understand the emotional and lifestyle implications of that home purchase. And so we're going to talk through all of those things today on the podcast. I think to get started, it would be helpful to talk a little bit about our own home buying journeys. So I'll start for myself. I purchased my home coming up on 7 years ago. And it was when I had started back here full-time at Legacy Planning. I had come from a previous employer, but I knew that I was now going to be based out of the Lehigh Valley and was going to be able to lay down some roots here. My family is very, very close. I live about 10 minutes away from my parents, about 15 minutes from my brother and his family. So knowing that I had that social framework here and the family network here, I was confident to make that home purchase just about 7 years ago. Justin, what's your journey in the home?
Yeah, so similar to John, I kind of knew that I wanted to lay my roots down up in the Poconos where I'm from. Very similar. All my family lives there. I only live a couple minutes away from my parents, which is both a cursing and a blessing at the same time. But, my journey was actually building my own home. So my dad in a past life was a contractor. So I capitalized on a lot of that skill set and knowledge that he had. In 2023, we started to build my house. So we did most of the work ourselves. I joke often that it was a second full-time job for both of us, and truthfully, it was. Many weeknights, weekends, for about a year and a half until we had completed the project. But that's been my journey, so a little bit different than just going out and writing a check for it, but definitely valuable nonetheless.
And on the contrast, I am still renting. So I'm going to be the renter. I've been renting here for probably 2 or 3 years now, and I'm actually getting ready to purchase my first home in the next couple of years. So this episode to me, and hopefully to you as well, is very top of mind for me. So
Absolutely. That's perfect. Like we talked about, and I think we touched on it a little bit as we talked about our own situations. Before we get into any of the financial aspects of it, when we're at the very beginning stage of understanding that home purchase, I think it's important to understand, again, what we're looking for and why, right? Start with the why. So, Joe, I'm going to turn to you, as someone who's kind of starting to get into the thick of the home search and evaluating things like what are some of those things that you're thinking about? What are some of the whys?
yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is, like kind of how you guys mentioned in your background stories, like, do I want to be here long term, right? A home purchase is not maybe I'll move in a year or two kind of decision, right? It's a longer term decision. You are planning, literally planning roots, right? You want to make sure that you're going to be there for a long term. But I think one of the sayings that I've heard the most and I've helped clients with as well is when you're renting, that's the most you'll ever pay. Your monthly payment is the most you'll ever pay. But on the contrast for a home, that mortgage is the least you'll ever pay because you have all the other stuff that we'll, I'm sure, get into in just a second here. But I think it's important to know, at least on the mental side of it, what are your wants versus your needs, right? So I think what my wants are, I think, are pretty high, right? And my wife and I, we want a pretty nice house. However, what we need for only 2 people is very, very different, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something we all need to think about, is that obviously there's a big difference between want and need. But the other part of it too is, when you look at a beautiful house, maybe it's got all these bedrooms, bathrooms. It's got all this land. It's got all these different things. I think it's important to think about that. That's maintenance and upkeep, right? And unless you're employing a household staff, which, let's face it, probably none of us are on this podcast and our viewers, that's going to fall on a lot. It's going to fall on you. So it's finding that right balance of amenities and features and your own maintenance and upkeep and effort that's going to have to go into that. Justin, how has the kind of the picture for a first-time home purchase changed over time? Like, do you think has there been a change in kind of our mindsets around it as a society?
Yeah, I mean, it has evolved just in the last couple of years and decades as well. I was sharing a story with Joe earlier. My grandmother, my mem, I know it's a Dutchy term, PA Dutch, but my mem, when she was young, the first house that they had didn't have indoor plumbing. So the household that she grew up in didn't have indoor plumbing. And, if we were to think about that today, nobody would be buying a house without indoor plumbing. Right. And that wasn't that long ago. 50s and 60s, that still was typical that there was an outhouse. And then you had to go outside to do some of those things. But certainly, since that time, we've come a long way. And especially, since about 2000 or so, the lifestyle creep. So everybody wants more, better, bigger. Instead of getting that half a double in town, people want the nicer townhouse or something out in the country. Of course, that typically comes with a bigger price tag as well.
Yeah.
I think you bring up a great point, Justin, because at least from my perspective, you're coming out, right? In college, you lived hopefully in a dorm or you lived at home, right? And you had wall neighbors or you had people who were living with you. You get out into the field and you're like, you know what? Maybe I don't want, at least this is the lifestyle creep that I think I've been experiencing. It's like, maybe I don't want to live in a townhome because I want to have my own land and I want to have no wall neighbor and whatnot. But it's really easy to say, hey, well, a townhome is kind of a starter home if you think about it, right? And part of what makes it affordable is that you have that person near you, right? So, or other people near you. So it is definitely a lifestyle creep, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's tough. I mean, just like we talk about social media and kind of the peer pressure that comes with that, or the FOMO, right? Fear of missing out on all sorts of different topics, and a lot of it relates to finances too. But the same is true for housing, right? We see what's available. Now we have, Zillow and other apps. I mean, you can literally see like all the houses in the world, it seems like. And you could see how beautiful a lot of them are. And it can definitely set up that feeling of like, oh man, I gotta have that really decked out house or first house. And it's interesting. We can see statistics on that lifestyle creep. So one of the things we see is that if we go back, say, to the 1980s, so 45 years ago, the average kind of home size was about 1,600 square feet. And a lot of times there might have just been one full bathroom for the full house, right? So one full bath, meaning a shower and a toilet for an entire house. When we look forward to today, average home size has gone up, and by some measures now it's about 2,300 square feet. Now we're talking about, multiple full baths, right? And I know I'm part of the problem. I know for myself, when I bought my house, I was in the hunt, I wanted at least 2 full baths, right? That was like 2 full baths, 2.5, right? 2.5 was my goal. And so it's very easy, right? And it's very easy to fall into that trap of always trying to keep up. So I think that's something we have to take a look at. I think we'll talk about this later too. I think some of it also can fall on the side of just construction and what new home construction looks like as well. Maybe we don't have as many choices in starter homes as we did in the past too. But we got to control what we can control. And so part of that is having those more kind of measured and realistic expectations for ourselves, at least for our first home.
Yeah, nobody wants that pink bathroom from 1950. I frequent Zillow, and every time I see that, I go, ooh, I think I'm gonna skip this one.
No, I think mauve would be a good color.
Maybe it would be John.
So we started to talk a little bit about this, right? Some of the non-financial factors when we're evaluating things. But Justin, would you talk a little bit more about, if someone's going out, they're in the market now for their first home, like what are some of those factors that they should be thinking about?
Sure. Yeah, if you're talking to anybody in real estate, the number one rule is location, location, location. That's a big factor for most people. Most people don't want to drive an hour or 2 hours to work, so you're kind of going to be limited to where you work, essentially. So for me, fortunately, I got the turnpike. I only have about a 30-minute commute, and that's still accessible for me. But I certainly wouldn't want to drive much more than that. So a lot of folks, that's going to be the first place they look is, I plan to work at this location, or I already work at this location. I want to be within, X amount of distance to be able to get to and from work.
You bring up a great point, Justin. A lot of my friends are teachers, and one of the first comments they say when they're going for the house hunt is, I don't want to be in the district, right? So that location part of it, right? I think naturally you're like, well, how close can I get to work to mitigate maybe the gas or the travel to get in? But for some people, depending on your profession, you're like, hey, listen, I don't want to see my students and their teacher or their parents in the grocery store. I want to make sure that I'm separated enough for that. So
yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think this is where sometimes, especially if you're going to be looking at a house where it's far away from where you grew up, I think there can be a lot of benefit to either doing a short-term rental or like an Airbnb or something for a period of time before you make a decision to get a feeling of that location, right? And I talk about this with new home purchases, but also for clients who are buying kind of their vacation or retirement home, right? They want to move, they want to buy the house in Florida they've always been dreaming of and that kind of thing. And what we remind them is, when you're buying a home somewhere, that's a lot different than being on vacation somewhere, right? Because when you're on vacation for a week, maybe where the grocery store or the bank or whatever, all those amenities of daily life, that doesn't really matter. But when you're living somewhere, it matters a lot. So I would make that recommendation to someone where if you're moving far away from a place that you've been familiar with, it may not be a bad idea to, again, do a short-term rental. Maybe it's several weeks or a month at the minimum to really get a sense of the location you're going to be in. I think that can lead to a lot happier outcome long-term.
I think you're spot on with that. But Justin, what other financial factors might we want to consider?
Yeah, obviously, we want to live, we want to have fun, we want to do enjoyable things. So considering the environment that you live in, for myself, I admittedly am not a very urban person. I don't do well in an urban setting, so being more rural is important to me. And some people may feel similar. Other people may feel the complete opposite. They say, what do you mean I have to drive 15 minutes to the grocery store? I can walk down the street and be right there. So considering that as well, and being close to things that you like to do. If you're an outdoorsy person, maybe being close to state parks or running trails or an area that has that outdoor recreation. Or again, if you're more of an indoor person, maybe you want to be closer to museums or movie theaters or something along those lines as well.
I think you bring up a great point, and just thinking what you said spoke to me in that if you're more rural, there's also other parts of that actually are different than if you live in the city, right? If you have land, guess what? You're going to have to mow the lawn. And as somebody who's renting right now, it is a miracle. It's such a nice benefit to not have to mow the lawn. I'm sure other people would agree with that.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot more to that too. Snow removal, maintenance. There's lots of things that as a renter you may not think of or realize that, hey, if I own, I'm responsible for this deal.
That's big. And same thing with square footage inside the house again, right? Like if it's, one or two people in a big house, that's a lot of dusting, a lot of vacuuming, a lot of Lysol. So, we got to make sure that it's the right fit for that situation and for your personal preferences. So somebody goes through this process, they've identified all these factors. Let's say, hey, I've got a good sense of where I want to be located, my proximity to work or family, my kind of environment. I think I've got all those factors sort of in hand. Now, how do I start figuring out the financial component? So, Justin, what would you say, like as someone who's getting ready to do it, like what are some things they can do to start building out the financial piece?
Yeah, so you're really gonna have to set a budget. You're gonna have to take your wants and needs. Obviously we want to meet all of our needs and hopefully as many wants as we possibly can, and kind of get a ballpark of, well, what would that cost? And then you have to compare that to, what can I afford? So you're gonna have to take a look at your expenses. So estimate your mortgage costs, your principal and interest, property taxes, homeowners insurance, HOA fees if you're in an area with an HOA. Utilities and repairs, that's something that most people might not consider either. If you're buying something that's not new, there may be a need to do some repairs. And having done some construction, repairs typically aren't cheap, even if you're doing them yourself.
Right.
So definitely a good place to start looking is kind of those anticipated costs, and getting an idea of what you can afford.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I remember when I was buying my house, that's exactly what I did. And it was kind of good old fashioned pen to paper and Excel spreadsheet. Like it wasn't too fancy, but it was listing out all the different categories and like seeing, can I do this without completely strapping myself, right? And having no money left over for savings or other things, which we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, getting it out on paper, right? Simple as that is, I think that's really the first step.
And I think an important part here too is, you might not even know what is that monthly principal and interest going to cost. There are a ton of free calculators online that you plug in. Here is the type of house that I am looking to buy. Here's the amount that I currently have as a down payment. And here is the estimated principal and interest that is going to be paid. Obviously, you have to put in an interest rate, right? So usually they'll give you a suggested one, but that can greatly change what your estimated payment might be.
And one of the ways I've worked with people to kind of figure out that affordability for the mortgage is to use that actually in combination with saving for the down payment. So, if we know we're going to have a certain amount we're going to have to put down, right? We're going to come out of pocket for a certain amount to get into this house. Obviously, we got to build that up. But one way that we can help that effort is to kind of stress test our cash flow. So let's say we go through the mortgage calculator and we find out that, mortgage, the principal and interest, homeowners insurance, property tax, just to make up a number, let's say that comes up to $2,000 a month, right? Well, we know we're going to need that cash flow every month. So we better start acting like that's our cost today. So if someone's still living at home, for example, or not paying any rent or mortgage, I'd tell them, listen, take that $2,000 a month and have an automatic contribution to a high yield savings account happen every month without you thinking about it. That feels like that mortgage payment, right? It feels like that housing cost. So you'll be able to see over time in your checking account if this is sustainable or not. And if checking is always going down and down and down month after month, then that means that number is too high for your housing costs. We're going to have to look at something a little bit lower. And then the same or similar is true if someone's renting, right? If your rent payment is X and the mortgage would be Y, well, let's save that differential, right? That higher amount, whatever that gap is, that should be going into that high yield savings account too, to help build up for a down payment. But the idea is to really get yourself in the mindset that this is what the cost is going to be, and I have to make sure I'm going to be able to bear that expense in order to have this house.
I think that's an excellent activity. I mean, really, it helps you build the financial muscle to get ready for that next step of that. Because quite frankly, hopefully, you know what you're saving month to month, right? But actually putting hey, guess what? That money's not going to be there anymore in your account is really it's going to hit the road. You know what I mean? So I think that's great.
Yeah. And so, Justin, obviously, I think that's helpful, like I said, for kind of a test drive or stress testing. At the same time, obviously, we don't want housing costs to be, everything inside of someone's budget, right? There's got to be room for other things. There's got to be room for long-term savings and just other expenses in general. Are there some guidelines around how much of someone's income should be dedicated to their house or other debt?
Yeah. So you're spot on. You don't want to be house poor, essentially. Your cash flow may be able to pay for the house, but if you can't pay your car insurance, groceries, utilities, then it doesn't really do you any good. So typically, you don't want to really exceed the 28% of your gross income. Because at that point, it's still affordable, that you can afford the mortgage. And as long as you're budgeting and keeping track of your expenses, that's a manageable level that you can maintain at.
So when you say 28%, we're thinking principal and interest, property taxes, and homeowners insurance?
Yep. Everything that would be going into that new house payment, that would be that 28%.
Okay, very good. Now, let's say people have other types of debt on top of that, like maybe they have a car loan or personal loans or anything like that. Like, what do people typically say, and what do banks also say? Obviously, that's got to be a factor too, right?
That is kind of the more important piece, because the lenders, they like to see that your debt to income ratio is at certain levels. So for them, they don't want to see that you really have more than 36% of your gross income going to debt payments.
Okay.
Because at that point, you may be able to afford it, but you start to run the risk of default. And obviously, from the lender's perspective, they don't want that. And from your perspective, you don't want that either. You don't want to be cash neutral or cash negative each month, right, to be able to afford these things.
Absolutely.
And I think it all ties in, Justin, you said at the beginning, just because you can mortgage it doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it, right? The max is not necessarily what you should do.
Right. Yep.
So we talked a little bit around mortgage, and calculating what a mortgage payment would be, and the debt ratios and that sort of thing. But maybe we should get kind of a little bit more detailed on mortgage for people, especially for first-time home buyers. So, Joe, I'll turn to you. Kind of what do we typically see when we talk about a mortgage, right? What does that often look like, and what are the different types there?
Yeah, I'll start with the most basic types of mortgages. I've done a lot of research on this for my hopeful eventual first mortgage, but the most common types of mortgages you see are usually fixed rate mortgages, right? There's very different types of terms, but the most common ones that we see are 15-year and 30-year, right? Obviously, the shorter the term, the more the payment is going to be, because you're not stretching it out as long. But depending on your goals or when you're getting that, I would say probably most first-time homeowners are going for a 30-year mortgage, unless you're really buying a smaller type of home for that. So that's the first one. The second type is adjustable rate mortgages, right? And that's when it's a more variable rate of interest on the loan, right? Typically starts off a little lower, but can change very drastically when interest rates change. So when we typically see people do that, it's more for maybe they're not going to be there as long as when they had originally thought of it, right? If they're like, hey, you know what? I may move in 5 years or so. That's when we usually see these adjustable rate mortgages.
Yeah, they were very popular a number of years ago, going into the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. I think from what I've seen, a lot of that popularity has kind of fallen by. But there are definitely still some kind of specialty and usage cases where people will take those out. But just to come back, so the 15 year, the 30 year, like you said, both are fixed. Obviously, the 15 years a shorter time frame. That means the monthly payment is going to be higher. But why would someone consider the 15 year?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on your cash flow position, right? If you're, I would say 15 years is more for maybe a future home, maybe not necessarily your first home purchase.
Okay.
Because maybe you're trying to, you've already have some home equity that you're rolling over into a new home, and you don't need as long of a runway. So I'm thinking of people who are maybe later into their career, and I'm going to pick on a 50-year-old here, right? They have 15 years until standard retirement around age 65.
Okay.
And they want to make sure that they have no debt going into retirement, right? Sure. That might be a case that we see a 15-year.
Is there any incentive for choosing that? Does the bank give you any benefit for?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is typically you'll get a little bit of a discount on the interest rate as well. So let's say the 30 year is at 7%. If you go with the 15, and the bank may give you 6.5, they may cut you a deal there. Over the long term too, it's also beneficial for the borrower because you're paying much less interest. If you look at the breakdown between a 15 and 30 year for the same loan amount, that 30 year is going to cost you exponentially more in interest, just because the payments are that much longer as well.
And I think one thing also to bear in mind for people who are listening is, some people will say, hey, I really would like the idea of getting my home paid down faster, but I'm not 100% sure that I can do it. I think most 30-year loans will allow you to pay back quicker, right? Mm-hmm. So this is an important thing, I think, for our viewers to understand that even if you take out a 30-year mortgage, right? Obviously, that's the requirement, is that it's paid off in 30 years. But the vast majority of the time, you can make extra payments every month, or you can make lump sum payments to the principal. So, you may end up paying off that mortgage in 15 or 20 years or whatever kind of makes sense for your situation. But in the meantime, you have the flexibility of a little bit lower monthly payment. And that's a way I've seen a lot of people kind of give themselves the benefit of flexibility, while also working toward that goal of getting debt-free faster.
So speaking of different types of payments, I mean, obviously the first payment is the down payment, right? Yeah. So as somebody who is doing all the analysis and whatnot and getting ready for that first time home purchase, how much should they be putting down on that first home or a home in general? Mm-hmm. Or what the different types are, yeah.
Yeah. So what I've typically seen, and there's different loan programs. So this is an important thing. There's what we call conventional loans, there's VA loans, there's a lot of different stuff in between. I think I'll focus for a moment on the conventional, because that's generally what people are who are watching this, probably are first-time home buyers. It's probably what they're going to be using. Most of the time for a conventional loan, your down payment amount is going to be 20% to avoid what's called mortgage insurance, or PMI, right? So PMI is a payment that will allow you to get a lower down payment, but then it gets tacked onto your monthly bill. So as you're paying your mortgage back every month, you're paying principal and interest, but you're also paying this PMI until you hit that loan to value ratio in the home, which is about that 80% loan to the value of the home. So PMI is something that can help get you into a home faster if you don't have a bunch of money saved up. But over the long term, it really is an expense with no benefit. It's of no benefit to you financially, except that it gets you into a home faster, right? It doesn't build equity in the house. It's not an investment. So I think people have to weigh that decision to try to get into a home with a lower down payment and have that ongoing payment for a time.
So you would say essentially that PMI is insurance on the lending side, just in case you take your payment.
Yeah, it's 100% protection for the lending. There's no doubt about that. Now, like I said, there are other programs. FHA is another one I just came to mind. A VA, for example, if someone qualifies for a VA or Veterans Administration loan, many of those are 0% down payments. And also, I would say there are other programs that are available. Some banks, especially kind of more local or community banks, will do first-time home buyer programs that will let you do a lower down payment with no PMI. So there's a bank here in the Lehigh Valley that I'm thinking of. I know that they advertise a program like that. For healthcare professionals, especially doctors, doctor mortgages are very common where they're also 0% down. So there are those kind of specialty cases where even if you don't qualify for a VA or federal program, that you can still get into a house with less of a down payment.
So slight shift. So you need cash to have a down payment, right?
Right.
So kind of going back to our cash management episode, am I allowed to dip into my emergency fund to pay down this down payment, or is that something I should be saving up completely separately?
No, you should be saving it up separately. No, and that's a really good point. Good question, Joe. We don't want to see people invading their emergency funds for the down payment on a house, because emergencies can still happen, right? And matter of fact, it often is the case when you get into a new house that you have more expenses than you expected, right? Like you were saying, the repairs, but even other things, just furnishing, stuff you were not accounting for. It's sometimes hard to account for all those costs. So no, I definitely would counsel people, your emergency fund's your emergency fund. It's the 3 to 6 months that stays where it's at. And the home down payment account or balance is a completely separate piece.
I think that's excellent advice. I say that jokingly because I have friends who bought a house in Whitehall, and not even before they got into the house, they had it inspected. They had to completely replace the roof on their new home immediately. So imagine saving up all your money for your down payment, and oh, by the way, that'll be about 20 grand for a roof replacement.
Yeah. Things like that happen all the time. So another question I think that often comes up is the debate, the great debate. I'll call it the great debate. And this applies to all sorts of different types of debt. But it's the debate about, should I try to get debt free as soon as possible, or should I be dedicating some of my income toward investments while I still have debt outstanding? And I think for this conversation, we'll get it specific to a mortgage. So I get my house, I have a mortgage every month. I have income, and I can choose to either pay down that mortgage faster or put some money into my 401k or IRA or other type of investment. So how do we go about making that decision? And Justin, I'll turn to you. What are some things you think people should have in mind?
Yeah, you got to consider the costs, your opportunity cost. For your mortgage, that's the interest. So that's the key factor that's going to determine if it makes sense to drive funds there. Because the alternative typically, as you mentioned, is putting it towards an investment. So when you're doing that calculation, you have to consider, well, let's say my mortgage is 7%. Okay, you have to compare that with, well, what could I expect if I invested this into some type of portfolio somewhere? And that's really driven by your age, your risk tolerance, the type of portfolio that you're in. But if you're in a stock portfolio, you may be able to expect 10 or 8 to 10%. So your opportunity cost there is 1 to 3%. So the math, not the emotional or behavioral, but the math says that it would be better to invest that next dollar, because the rate of return on that dollar is actually going to be better towards the investment than paying off the loan.
Mm-hmm. I think you bring up a great point, Justin. I was actually on watching some short form content recently, and there was this one influencer who was really talking about, I just paid an additional payment on my mortgage, and she had it all out in her spreadsheets, and for each payment, it calculated how much interest she was saving on her loan, right? But I think you brought up a great point. If we are saving that difference between the additional payment and that, we would need to make sure that it's going towards a longer term asset and not just sitting under the mattress collecting dust.
Yeah, and I think the other part that makes it tough for people is that investment returns are uneven, right? Mm-hmm. So if your mortgage, let's use the 7% interest rate. We know if I make an extra payment, I'm saving 7% on that money, right? Because that would be the cost of that interest over time. But if I'm putting it in an investment, one year that investment might be up 15 or 20%. It might be down 10 or 20 or 30 or more percent, depending on what you're invested in the next year, right? It's a wide ride, especially if we're investing in the stock market. Mm-hmm. So I think the person that does that investing, in certain circumstances, it can be very beneficial, but it has to be done with a lot of discipline and understanding of how the investment markets work and a long-term focus, right? A mortgage is a long-term proposition, and an investment should also be a long-term proposition. So we have to look at those over, really, in my opinion, decade time frames for both, not just a couple years in either direction.
So I think we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is that housing prices have gotten way more expensive, especially since the pandemic, to prior years, right? Normally we say inflation's around, 2 to 3%, and quite frankly, it's gotten much higher in those most recent years, right? But I think if we go back to our original example, right, going all the way back to 1980 when we talked about one full bath being the expectation of a new home, right? Let's put some numbers to that, right? So the average home back in 1980 was $47,000. I would kill for that home right now, to be honest. But the average household income at that time was $21,000 per household, right? So really, that's 2 to 1, right? You could afford your home if you put everything to it, which very clearly you probably couldn't, right? that's in 2 years you could cover that technically if you had no other expenses, right? But if we bring that to today, that average home today is $400,000, right? Significant increase, which is to be expected over what, 45 years, right? That's a long time for inflation to do its work. But the average household income, it hovers around $75,000, right? So now we're looking at more closer to five and a quarter ish to the price of the home, right? So that has definitely, the gap has increased between the average household income increasing and the average home price.
Yeah, I mean that's a big deal, and that's undeniable. I mean that's just the math behind it is we have fallen behind as far as affordability and the ease for us to get into a home, especially for a first timer. And I think that, I know certainly amongst my generation, and I think I'd like to think I'm in the same generation as you guys, but we'll let the experts determine that. I think there's a lot of frankly resentment about that, right? Young people are you go on social media, you see young people are angry about seems like housing is out of reach, or that it is so much more expensive, and they have a right in the sense that they are right about the information. But at the same time, I think, again, it has to come back to what can we control ourselves? Like, there's many things we can get angry about, but what can we do to address it? And I think that, again, comes back to why planning is even more important than ever. So making prudent decisions, really analyzing what's important to us, what is needed and helpful, and what are luxuries in the home that maybe we could do without. I mean, we got to control what we can control. And so I think that's where the focus for young people, including ourselves, has to be when we're making decisions about housing. And we'll see over time, I think there's potential that at some point we see more of like the new, like first time homes being built. And I think if our price signal stays there, I think that will help encourage people to do that. But we have to control what we can control in the meantime.
Agreed. I think the biggest thing I heard from that, John, was you need to be intentional, right? You're not just going to magically stumble into your dream home at some point or your first home. You need to be intentional about saving for that eventual, whether using some of the techniques that we used or building your own savings plan. But you need to be very aware of how you're positioning yourself to get into that first time.
Right. Now, to wrap up a little bit, I'm going back a step. One of the things we hear about, sometimes people say, is, I got to get out. I'm renting right now. I got my apartment. I got to get out of this apartment, man. And the classic saying, I'm throwing money away, right? I'm paying all this money every month for my rent, and it's going to the landlord, and I'm not building any equity. I'm not building up an asset. I got to get out as soon as possible. And I understand, Joe, you did a little bit of research into this and helping us to understand, what is that break-even point, right? Because, yeah, we may not be building up equity in rent, but in a home, we've got other types of expenses. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. I said earlier in this volume that renting is the most you'll ever pay per month, and home is the least you pay, right? The mortgage is the least you'll ever pay, right? And for those of us who you have been listening for a little bit now, going back to our debt management episode, this example might sound very familiar, right? Mm-hmm. So what we've done, and we're going to put it up on the screen here in just a second. What we have is I ran a comparison between buying and renting at a similar rate, right? So on the left-hand side here, you see we have a home purchase, right? And we've picked an average home, actually a little bit lower than the average numbers we used before, of $300,000 home, right? Mm-hmm. Down payment is around 6.7%, right? Interest is around 6.5%, and you're loaning that for 30 years. And then we've disclosed some closing costs and everything in there, right? And we've compared that to what if you're renting right now for $1,750 a month right now, right? And what it shows us is that in this scenario, buying is cheaper if you stay in that same home for 9.4 years or later. So that kind of reinforces, hey, if I am buying a home, this is a long-term decision, right? Because you're locking in housing prices essentially for 30 years, right? But if you're staying shorter than that, you plan on moving around, renting does make sense. Even if you're quote unquote throwing money away.
Well, I think that's really helpful to understand, and especially for younger people. I think that can maybe take a little bit of the pressure off. I'm not saying that we have to forever give up our dream of our first home purchase, but especially if you're at a point where you're young in your career, you're not 100% sure where you're going to be, in a couple of years' time, if you're going to be at the same job, if you're going to be in the same location. I think this kind of exercise can really help. I think of a client I had who was in her 20s. She was working in a different part of the state, and her and her family were really anxious to get her into a house. Have to get her into a house because the market's only getting more competitive. It's going to cost us blah blah blah. And they were ready to do it. And I had to have a conversation with them to say, listen, this may not be where she wants to be or will be in a couple of years. Let's take some time on this decision. It's all right. Let's have her rent for a little bit longer. And within about a year, she had moved 4 hours away from that location, but totally different part of the state. So again, in that type of environment, she probably was a lot better off by renting. So I think, Joe, I thank you for working on this. I think this is important information that people have, that, if you're in that spot right now, it doesn't mean that it's the worst thing in the world, right? There's an opportunity to make a plan intentionally for when the time is right for that first home. Well, thank you all again for joining us for the Future Value Podcast. We hope you gained a lot of helpful information and insight from this episode. Please continue to follow us, hit that subscribe button, and stay tuned for future episodes of the Future Value Podcast. Take care.